Thank you very much for tuning in. The title of this talk is Learning to Anticipate Contrast with Prosody, a visual word study with L2 learners, authored by Chie Nakamura, Jesse Harris, and Sana Zhang. Previous studies that tested anticipatory use of prosody in sentence processing have shown that native speakers process prosodic cues rapidly to predict an upcoming speaker-intended referent. For example, in this well-known study of Ito and Spear, they tested participants' eye movements in a visual search task using instructions such as first, hang the white star, now hang the yellow star. Their results showed that low plus high star on a contrastive adjective in the second portion of the instruction led listeners to predict the upcoming referent. With this result, they provided evidence for the anticipatory use of prosody, showing that native speakers pre-activate likely content and pre-update presentations prior to encountering the predicted stimulus using prosodic information. Now, the purpose of our study is to investigate how prosodic cues are used in L2 processing. In particular, we are interested to see whether L2 learners can use prosody in an anticipatory manner. In fact, there is increasing evidence that shows L2 learners also use linguistic information to restrict the selection of upcoming information. One such evidence comes from our previous study, where we showed that L2 learners are, much like native speakers, sensitive to the alignment of prosodic boundary and syntax. And there are other studies that showed anticipatory use of other grammatical information by L2 learners, such as the lexical semantics of verbs and gender-marked adjectives. In our previous study, we tested L2 learners' sensitivity to the alignment of prosodic boundary and syntactic structure. In this study, we recorded participants' eye movements on the scene while they heard the sentences with attachment ambiguity, such as, "The boy will see the tiger with the binoculars." This study showed that L2 learners adapted different syntactic structures depending on the location of the prosodic boundary. When L2 learners heard a boundary after the direct object, they attached the ambiguous phrase to the verb more, which was reflected in the increased looks to the instrument binoculars. And when they heard a boundary before the direct object, they attached the ambiguous phrase to the noun more, which was reflected in the increased looks to the tiger that has the binoculars. Importantly, these eye movements to different objects were observed before the participants heard information of binoculars, which supports the view that L2 learners are sensitive to the prosodic and syntactic alignment and use the information in anticipatory processing. However, there are other studies that showed evidence against anticipatory processing in L2. There are studies that showed L2 learners are not able to make use of linguistic information as fast as native speakers, and that L2 learners have processing limitations in anticipating upcoming information. In particular, reduced ability to generate expectations hypothesis, often referred as the rage hypothesis, suggests that L2 learners have weaker ability to use linguistic information, which delays or prevents them from making detailed predictions about upcoming linguistic material. There is a general consensus in the past L2 studies that L2 processing is generally slower and less accurate compared to L1 processing. However, understanding of to which extent L2 learners can engage in anticipatory processing is rather mixed. The studies that support the strong version of the rage hypothesis assume that L2 learners are categorically unable to engage any processing beyond integrating words into structure, and that L2 processing would be purely reactive. Under this view, there should be no anticipation for upcoming information based on prosody in L2 processing. On the other hand, the studies that support the weak version of the rage hypothesis assume that L2 learners are able to anticipate upcoming information when the integration is relatively simple, and that L2 processing would be selectively proactive. Under this view, L2 learners would be able to anticipate the upcoming information based on prosody if the task is simple and does not demand extensive cognitive effort. In the current study, in order to test L2 learners' anticipatory processing, we recorded native speakers and L2 learners' eye movements in a visual search task in which they heard instructions with different accents. In the task, participants heard the first portion of the instruction, first find a red cat, followed by the second portion of the instruction, next find a purple cat. The color adjective of the second sentence carried a non-contrastive high stir accent or a contrastive low plus high stir accent. Between these conditions, if L2 learners do not use the prosodic difference to predict an upcoming referent, as it is assumed under the strong rage hypothesis, there should be no difference in eye movement patterns between these conditions before the onset of cat. On the other hand, if L2 processing is selectively proactive, as it is assumed under the weak rage hypothesis, then we should observe different eye movement patterns between the conditions before the onset of cat. In the experiment, participants looked at a picture on the computer screen and simultaneously heard the corresponding instructions. In this experiment, we tested whether listeners anticipate the upcoming information when the second color adjective carries a low plus high stir accent. Thus, the expected pattern of anticipatory eye movements would be that participants immediately look at a purple cat as soon as they encounter the information of purple with low plus high stir accent. For participants, we had 36 native speakers of English as an L1 control group. For L2 group, we had 29 Japanese speakers who are learning English as a second language. The English proficiency level of L2 participants was intermediate to advanced in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. Before we talk about the results of the experiment, I'd like to go over the prosodic difference between English and Japanese. In Japanese, focus is realized by pitch range expansion on the focused word, which is similar to English. However, unlike the high stir and low plus high stir distinction in English, which differs by a rising F0 slope on the stress level, the pitch range expansion in Japanese does not involve a change in the rising slope on a specific syllable. In Japanese, a lexical pitch accent, which is realized by high stir low, can occur in any more of a word, and the focused word initial rising slope depends on the syllable structure of the word initial syllable. Given these phonological differences between the two languages, it would be interesting to see whether Japanese speakers can interpret the rising slope difference between high stir and low plus high stir in English and use the information in anticipatory processing. In each experiment, the proportion of looks made to the target object was analyzed using LMA model. In the model, we included prosody, which was either high stir or low plus high stir on the color adjective, block, which was 90 trials divided into 3 blocks, as well as an interaction between prosody and block. For L2 learners' data, we also included their proficiency level in the model. The time window we used for analysis was the duration of color adjective. The onset of the color adjective was time-locked and analyzed until the minimum onset of the target word. And in the results section, we're going to call this time window anticipatory time window. How much participants looked at the target object in the anticipatory time window should reflect eye movements made to the target object before participants heard the disambiguating information. First, we will see the results of native speakers as a control group. Again, in the analysis, we are looking at how much participants looked at the target object on hearing the adjective information before the onset of the noun. This graph shows the proportion of looks to the target object for the duration of purple. In native speakers data, as a sanity check, we wanted to see whether native speakers use low plus high stir pitch accent to anticipate the upcoming referent. The red line shows how much participants looked at the target object in the low plus high stir condition, and the blue line shows how much participants looked at the target object in the high stir condition. The results showed exactly what we predicted. There was a main effect of prosody in the anticipatory time window, showing that native speakers used contrastive accent to anticipate the upcoming word. Next, in this slide, we will see the results of L2 learners. Again, this graph is showing how much L2 learners are looking at the target object in the anticipatory time window. As you see here, the red line is above the blue line, meaning that L2 learners also looked at the target object more with the low plus high stir condition than with the high stir condition. And this effect was observed in the anticipatory time window. In addition to this main effect of prosody, with L2 learners, there was also a marginally significant effect of prosody and block, which suggests the possibility that L2 learners' use of prosody changed over the course of the experiment. We will come back to this point in a little bit. But first, if we compare the native speakers graph and L2 learners graph side by side, you might notice that the high stir and the low plus high stir conditions started to diverge at an earlier point with L2 learners compared to native speakers. This raises the possibility that L2 learners were more sensitive to the different F0 value before the peak, and we're gonna call this possibility as early anticipatory use of prosody. To test the possibility of early anticipatory use of prosody by L2 learners, we compared the F0 value in the find the segment in next find the red cut between high stir and low plus high stir conditions. This graph shows the difference in mean F0 value in each condition, and the acoustic analysis confirmed that the F0 value before the rise was lower in the low plus high stir condition than in the high stir conditions. This supports the possibility that L2 learners used the phonetic difference in F0 before the adjective to anticipate the target noun on the following adjective. However, when we analyze the looks to the target object during the find the segment, the difference between the two tonal conditions did not turn out to be significant. So, further studies will be needed to confirm the possibility of early anticipatory use of prosody by L2 learners. And as it was mentioned 3 slides before, L2 learners showed a marginally significant interaction between prosody and block, which suggested the possibility of L2 learners' learning effect. To closely investigate whether L2 learners' use of prosody changed over the course of the experiment, we analyzed changes to the looks to the target object in the disambiguating time window, which is the duration of the final noun. This graph shows how the proportion of looks to the target object changed from trial 1 to trial 90. The x-axis is the trial number, and the y-axis shows how much L2 learners looked at the target object in this time window. As you see, L2 learners looked more at the target object with low plus high stir accent than they did, and they did less with high stir accent as they reached to the end of the experiment. A further analysis, in fact, confirmed that the effect of prosody was significant only in the third block, showing that the influence of the contrastive meaning of low plus high stir accent became stronger as L2 learners experienced more trials in the experiment. To summarize the results, in the current study, we first provided evidence for anticipatory use of prosody with L2 learners. The results showed that L2 learners looked more at the target object in the low plus high stir condition than in the high stir condition during the anticipatory time window. L2 learners were able to interpret the rising slope difference between high stir and low plus high stir in English intonation. They were also able to recruit the knowledge of the meaning difference between the two tonal patterns to anticipate an upcoming referent. These results provide evidence against the strong view of range hypothesis. Secondly, the current study also suggested the possibility of early anticipatory use of prosody with L2 learners. The results showed that L2 learners were sensitive to pitch difference even before the onset of the color adjective. It was found that the F0 value for find the was lower in the low plus high stir condition than in the high stir condition, and the low F0 before the color adjective triggered L2 learners' anticipation of contrast. This interpretation is likely considering Japanese is a lexical pitch accent language, and it is possible that our L2 learners may have been more sensitive to F0 cues than native English speakers. At the same time, it is also possible that L2 learners in general tend to pay more attention to the phonetic details of the stimuli. Lastly, the current study also showed a learning effect of prosody with L2 learners. The results showed that the L2 learners' ability to correctly anticipate the upcoming referent increased as they experienced more trials in the experiment. In the results, we saw that the difference between high stir and low plus high stir was the largest in the final part of the experiment, which suggests the possibility that sufficient exposure to the mapping between prosody and its meaning may be necessary for L2 learners to begin anticipating upcoming speech using prosody. No such learning effect was observed with native speakers, most likely because as a native speaker, they already know the conventional meaning of a low plus high stir accent as contrastive. Thank you very much for your attention. We would like to thank Stephanie Rich and the undergraduate RAs at the UCLA Language Processing Lab and Injin at the Waseda University BLIT Lab.